Legislative leaders and the governor met this week, but can they come up with a budget deal by the end of the month? We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the show where we talk about Illinois politics and government. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues. And with us today is Jordan Abudayyeh from News Channel 20. Jordan, glad you're here.
Thank you for having me.
And Andy Maloney with the Chicago Daily Law Bulletin. Andy, thanks for coming back.
Good to be back.
So we got a lot to cover this week. Let's get rolling. The working groups that are trying to kind of work behind the scenes to figure out a budget plan before the end of the month presented some frameworks to leadership, especially what taxes might go up. Jordan, what are we seeing as far as revenue proposals and what things might be taxed in a final budget plan?
Yeah, so we all know that revenue is going to have to be a part of a final budget compromise, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. And so we're seeing an increase in the state income tax, which is something that rolled back when Governor Rauner won the election. And so we're seeing an increase in that up to, I think it was 4.75 or 4.85, something around there, but close to the 5% that it was before the tax increase rolled back. We're also seeing some possible ideas to increase revenue in other areas. So a tax on services that Illinois currently doesn't tax right now. So if you go to get your car repaired, you're not paying tax on that. And then also a soda tax, which would put a couple cent tax on sugary beverages, which I'm sure is going to be a big talker in the state as we move forward.
Well, and Andy, we don't know what the final plan will be, but it doesn't mean that all of these taxes will be in place. These are just the options, kind of a menu that's being put forth.
Right, and I think you heard some of that in the leaders meeting come out, and also just the leaders kind of talking about it afterward. Leader Jim Durkin, Republican leader in the House, said, "I'm hesitant to call this a framework even." So it's at a very preliminary stage, it sounds like, although the numbers are sort of there. They talked about generating something like $5.5 billion in revenue and mix that with $2.5 billion in cuts, something around there. So it's still early, even though it's late in the session. I think the governor acknowledged this, and we all know this from seeing sessions in action sort of come down to the wire. Things can start happening pretty quickly.
But Jordan, this is kind of a new development as far as folks speaking publicly about taxes that they might be able to support. What are some of the rank and file people, some of the folks on these committees saying about how they feel about these options?
I think everyone knows that taxes are going to have to be a part of a budget compromise. What we're seeing from the Republican side is that they're going to reluctantly agree to some tax increases, but they want the governor's turnaround reforms to be included in a final budget compromise because they say we can't raise taxes on people. And I think Senator Christine Radonio, who's the leader in the Senate, after she came out of the meeting this week with the governor and the leaders, she said, we're not going to ask Illinoisans to pay more for the same lousy government that they've been getting for years. So Republicans think that these reforms are going to change the trajectory of the state and the way government works, and they find them very critical and necessary to agreeing to any tax increase. If we don't get those reforms, you're not going to get Republicans to agree, and Democrats, despite having a supermajority in both chambers, are not going to be able to pass a tax increase on their own.
And Andy, what are some of those reforms? There's other groups looking at some of these things that the governor would like to see happen. Broadly, what are some of the things that they're talking about?
Right, it's sort of what the governor has been saying, since he was elected. You're talking about sort of collective bargaining changes, workers' compensation changes, and I think even some pension changes going forward. Things that he calls, necessary reforms. And tied to sort of the budget and the state of government as it currently is. Obviously, the Democrats have disagreed with that for a long time. Speaker Madigan especially strongly comes out and says that those don't need to be part of this year's budget or the annual budgeting process. So, but it's sort of the things that he's been saying since he sort of introduced the turnaround agenda.
Well, you've been here and watched pension reforms pass and workers' compensation in the past, and those took years, right? So this could be a bit of a tall order we've got less than 2 weeks left now.
Right, it'll be extremely difficult to get those things jammed through, for lack of a better term. Pension reforms, like you said, the one big pension bill that we got, which ended up being unconstitutional, 3 years, 4 years you're talking about before anything emerged and was able to get approval from from both chambers and the governor. So it's not something that can happen overnight. At least I don't think so. But they are, there's so many working groups now, it's kind of hard to keep track of them, and they've been talking about it for a while. So we'll have to see what develops in the next couple of weeks.
Well, and Jordan, you were there for that leaders meeting, waiting for folks to come out, seeing what the reactions were. The headlines out of it were kind of mixed messages or mixed reactions from folks. Take us a little behind those headlines. What were people saying when they came out?
So we had Senate President John Cullerton, Leader Durkin, and Leader Radonio all come out after the meeting. Speaker Madigan decided to release his reaction in a statement, and then he went to the House floor to introduce a bill couple hours after the meeting happened. So we saw the president come out and he said, I thought it was a good meeting. It was productive. He tends to be a little bit more positive. And he said, the governor's agreed to revenues, and that's really important to us. We know that revenues need to be a part of a budget compromise, but he didn't really touch on those reforms. And I'd actually talked to the Senate president a couple weeks before this meeting took place, and he said, things like pension reform, they're not easy to pass. The unions don't trust the governor right now because of the contract negotiation situation. And so it's going to be hard to get them on board with any sort of pension reform. The president will point to workers' compensation in 2011 when they passed that and said, we already did something like that. So it doesn't seem like Democrats are really ready to embrace those reforms fully, but they did agree to put some people on this working group. So we'll see if the rank and file are ready to compromise and have this budget impasse be over. But we did see Senator Radonio come out and say, I don't really trust that Speaker Madigan, calling him out specifically, is going to really agree with this process. I think any working group needs to include the speaker, the governor, and the leaders, because I don't see anything moving forward without the speaker on board.
Yeah, and as it often is in the State House, it's kind of getting down to what does the speaker want to do? And Andy, how is he reacting to this framework and these meetings? What are, we've heard a little from him, not a lot, but what's he saying?
Yeah, well, like Jordan said, he kind of reacted, didn't come out and talk directly to the media, but later sent out a statement where it kind of seems like, still blasting the governor in a way, saying that we've passed a few budget bills that didn't have these turnaround agenda items on them. And clearly
that's the formula.
That's the precondition for getting budget work done, is not having these items. As I'm sure we'll go over, he went to a rally of state workers and labor groups, and was very, very emphatic about still opposing Governor Rauner. And I think it was interesting that from this meeting you emerge kind of these separate factions on how they interpreted how things went. Senate President Cullerton, like Jordan said, positive, hey, we got a commitment from the governor to keep exploring new revenue. Leader Durkin saying, hey, we got a commitment from the speaker to investigate these working groups and these reforms and kind of remain open to them. But then on the flip side, you had Leader Radonio say, I don't really trust the speaker on that. And then you had Speaker Madigan go and again kind of come back and blast the governor. I think it's taking it as a positive that the governor had committed to taxes. You could argue he's been saying that for a while. He said, I think we need new revenue, but it has to come with these reforms. And I think overall, it's got to be so hard for those four to be in the same negotiating room after all of this. We got a little taste of it when they broadcast the meeting earlier this session. And I don't know what it's like in there when the cameras aren't in there, but it seems like it'd be pretty tough.
Well, let's get to that rally, Jordan. Labor groups came to Springfield this week to hold a rally. Pretty big turnout, actually made some national news as well. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened?
Yeah, we've seen a lot of rallies since this budget impasse started. It seems like there's one almost weekly, but we haven't seen one with these numbers. The Secretary of State Police estimate that there were 8,000 people outside, streets blocked off, and rallying basically against every single part of the governor's turnaround agenda, rallying against the governor himself, his policies, and it was really highlighting the fight between organized labor and Governor Rauner. When he came in, they started off with a rocky relationship with the right to work talk and the corrupt bargain talk that he was talking about in relation to state worker unions. And so we saw unions from across the state banding together, and we saw Speaker Madigan and President Collerton take the stage, say that they are going to fully support organized labor. They're not going to hurt the middle class. I mean, I think the interesting point is Speaker Madigan hasn't relented from his message that he believes that the governor's turnaround reforms are bad for middle class, lower class, working families, and he doesn't think that lowering their wages and their standard of living is a good idea. And he hasn't wavered from that message at all. He didn't waver from that message in the reaction, and he went on stage, and he's typically very reserved and was very boisterous against those reforms. So this rally, I think, was a good wake-up call to everyone that we're not as close to a deal, I don't think, as everyone thinks.
Well, and Andy, as Jordan said, we've seen a lot of these rallies over the years. Her speaking at it is kind of remarkable.
Yeah,
he typically doesn't go to these things.
Right.
So.
I was going to say, I don't think I've ever seen something quite like that. We mentioned the pension talks, and there were state workers and labor groups throughout all of that, wearing the same color shirt, chanting the same thing from the rotunda in the Capitol, right? But 8,000 to 10,000 people showing up in the Capitol, and to have the speaker kind of go and get into campaign mode almost, for lack of a better term. I haven't seen something quite like that in the few short years that I've been covering state government, but that is the important takeaway, is that if anything, it seems like he's just as defiant as he's ever been in terms of not going along with the governor's agenda.
Well, and then another group tried to make a showing at the State House this week, the Illinois Policy Institute, which is a think tank and lobbying group that pushes for smaller government and has been financially supported by the governor in the past. Jordan, how did that rally go? A lot smaller. What was the reaction there?
Yeah, it was very small. I'd say maybe 20 to 50 people at any one point. They stood outside the speaker's office with these t-shirts with cartoon Madigan's face on them and Obey at the bottom, and they were chanting, but the chants lasted 2 minutes in front of the speaker's office, and then they kind of just milled about the Capitol, talking to people, I guess. One of the less impressive rallies that we've seen. And I think because the Policy Institute is such a big player, especially in Springfield today, I think everyone thought it would be a lot larger of a rally. So I don't think it made much of an impact.
And looking ahead to the campaign, as I'm sure folks are, Andy, when you see these numbers of labor union folks turn out, and they traditionally back Democrats and are the ground game, and then you see the smaller rally, but the governor has that bank account that we can't forget about. I mean, what do you see when you see these groups turn out? And
I think that's more a calling card of labor, to kind of get the boots on the ground and get the support in the Capitol as the process is taking place. Obviously, the governor can wage a successful campaign. He lost some legislative races, or it was interpreted as him losing legislative races. He supported some candidates, but when you've got a bank account, you're always in contention, I think, especially in races that maybe aren't highly salient, maybe in the smaller races where it does matter how many signs you put in people's yards, how many flyers you can send out. But again, on the flip side, ASME, they represent 36,000 state workers, and when you have that kind of built-in base of support that is used to mobilizing in that fashion, I still see, even the disparity in the rally, that aside, I still see some even sides come campaign season.
Well, and as lawmakers are in session here at the end of the month, bills kind of start flying, things get moving. There are a few pieces of legislation that have been up for debate and that are moving along. Let's talk about some of those. One thing that's kind of stalled out right now, but that has a lot of attention, is regulation of fantasy sports betting, like your fantasy football, your fantasy baseball. Andy, what's going on with that bill? It moved kind of quickly in the House, and now it's slowed down in the Senate, maybe on hold.
Right. It had some trouble getting into the House, getting any traction in the House. So Senate sponsor Kwame Raoul from Chicago brings it to the Senate committee, gets through the Senate committee. It passed the Senate, I believe, yesterday. But now it's been put on hold. I think maybe one thought is that they're trying to get support again from the House because people were concerned that they were moving too fast. I think a good clarification for people just diving into this is that daily fantasy sports is a different entity than, say, your season-long Yahoo or ESPN fantasy that you play with friends and doesn't involve sort of the money transaction over the web. This is services like DraftKings and FanDuel, which were sort of advertised ad nauseum last fall, and they're trying to basically regulate it, get some revenue from it, make sure that no one under 21 is playing and betting over the internet. They also have legal challenges pending in court, so if this doesn't get through, there's still a way it could be legalized, but the people who support it are concerned that if they don't get it through the legislature, those types of services will have to pack up, at least in Illinois.
And of course, representatives of what we'd maybe call legacy gambling or casinos and other gambling in the state are opposing this legislation. They want to see fantasy sports betting highly regulated. Jordan, what are they saying, and are they kind of part of the holdup here? Or?
Well, I think anytime you expand gaming in the state, you're going to have the competitors who are the traditional casinos and stuff like that saying, well, that's going to hurt our business, or we have to face these regulations, pay these fees, pay these taxes. Why aren't they paying the same amounts? That was kind of the debate in the Senate yesterday, that it's a sliding scale for some of these sites. So some of them are smaller than the DraftKings and FanDuel that we see everywhere, but there are different smaller options. And so they pay less revenue. And I think it's competition for your money when it comes to gambling. And even though those fantasy sports sites will say it's not gambling, they see it as gambling, and they think it should face the same restrictions as gambling in the state.
Well, and lawmakers are taking another shot at marijuana decriminalization, which would make possession of small amounts of marijuana just a ticketable offense. Jordan, what's going on there? The governor's already rejected this once, but they've made some changes to it, right?
Yeah, so last session when the governor actually vetoed the bill, he sent back in a mandatory veto saying, just make these changes. I think it would be better this way. The House typically doesn't take up a mandatory veto, so the bill died. But the sponsor brought it back. It's passed. It has support. And it's a bipartisan bill because we're seeing Democrats and Republicans who are saying we need to reform the way our criminal justice system works, and we need to start saving money in that capacity and stop locking up these small level offenders. It was interesting that when the governor was asked about it this week, that he kind of brushed it off and said, well, I support this bill because if it's truly written in the way that I mandatorily vetoed it, I'm sure I don't have a problem with it, but it's kind of silly because we have a budget crisis and we're worrying about the state pie and how much weed someone can carry. I thought that was an interesting argument to make because the governor has created a panel to look at criminal justice reform. This is one of his goals, to reduce the prison population, and this is a step to get there. And he kind of brushed it off, but I do think we're probably going to see him pass that bill and support it.
Well, and Andy, you cover courts and legal issues. What kind of impact would legislation like this have as far as maybe unclogging our court system a little? Or
I think that's the goal. I think generally this is seen as sort of the low-hanging fruit. There wasn't a ton of pushback against sort of the idea of, okay, small-level cannabis, we know it's out there, let's make sure we're not prosecuting. There are a number of arrests. I think the governor pointed out in his mandatory veto, this is how many arrests are made off of, it's something like possession of 10 grams of cannabis. But again, it's generally viewed, I think, as one of the easier steps that they'd have to take. The commission that the governor created is still talking about bigger and broader reforms. But like you said, this is sort of an incremental step.
And we've seen some cities already do versions of this, right?
Right, yeah, and other states also looking at this. So again, there is sort of that broad support, and even though the governor kind of shifted focus, this is something that he should support because the bill that was passed is in line with what he called for in the mandatory veto.
Well, and another bill that folks had thought was probably down for the count in the Senate kind of revived, and that would be raising the age to buy cigarettes to 21. Jordan, we've seen this debate kind of nationwide. Other states are considering this. What's going on with that bill, and how did it kind of come back to life?
Yeah, so the city of Chicago passed similar legislation, and so we're seeing the sponsor of the bill say, if we can stop people from smoking at a younger age, then we could have less smokers. It makes us healthier. We could save money potentially in the long run. Smoking is very costly in the Medicaid system. And so the bill didn't get enough votes last time around. He postponed it for reconsideration, came back this time, passed the Senate, and I think some people were surprised, but it'll be interesting to see if it passes the House. This is one of those bills, though, that is a big talker, because you're going to get the other side of the debate who says you can fight a war and you can do all these other things at 18, but you can't smoke a cigarette. Why we have the daddy state telling us what you can and cannot do. So that's the other side, and obviously you have the tobacco industry and convenience stores who sell these items who say, 18 is a perfectly logical age to start this. So we'll see if it moves forward in the House.
And of course, Senate President John Cullerton is a big supporter of any anti-smoking measures. He was pivotal in getting the indoor smoking ban passed. Andy, might we not see as warm of a reception in the House of this legislation? Yeah,
the House is a little bit of a tougher sell, in part because you just have more members and a little bit more, it's a little bit more ruckus whenever anything gets to the House. And like you said, this is one of those issues that kind of splits the parties nicely along their ideological boundaries. You have Republicans saying this is government taking too big of a step, and Democrats saying, well, this is a measure that government can do that'll lead to healthier outcomes and have the twin effect of maybe saving money through Medicaid in the long run. So it would be, I think, a difficult sell in the House.
Well, in a story that we've been talking about on the show for a while now, looking at Auditor General and former House member Frank Martino's campaign spending, there was some news broken on that this week by the Illinois Times that some of his campaign staff members have been subpoenaed, and there's a federal probe going on. His office has confirmed. Jordan, what's happening there? Republican lawmakers have been calling on him to explain this stuff. Does this kind of move the needle that he's going to have to maybe talk a little bit more about what's going on?
Yeah, Republicans have been pressuring him for a few weeks now to really explain those campaign spending items, because a lot of Republicans behind the scenes will say, we were strong-armed into voting for him. He was a well-liked member, and, leaders told us that if we make this vote, it's not controversial, let's just do it. Meanwhile, some of them had some concerns and they weren't totally comfortable with it. So when these allegations came out, we saw a lot of those Republicans saying, we told you so. Now he needs to answer to these questions. I think the fact that it has taken so long, this has been going on for a few months now, to answer some of these questions doesn't look good. A lot of things in politics are optics. And so I think the sooner that Martino addresses these campaign spending allegations, the sooner we know the truth and it goes away or it moves forward.
Well, and what are, Andy, kind of the broad strokes of at issue here? It's maybe spending too much in the same places?
Yeah, there was a gas station, I believe, in his district where there were over $200,000 of campaign funds spent over an 11-year period. He was already facing an inquiry into this by the State Board of Elections, who wanted him to disclose details. We learned about the U.S. Attorney subpoenas this week. Even though I think they happened some time ago. So to the extent that this moves forward, obviously there's still sort of a ways to go in the process before we find out more, I think. But the vote for Auditor General, like you said, was very bipartisan. There was strong support, even though Illinois was considering some sort of outsiders, people who were not involved in Illinois politics. And so the longer this drags on, the more, I think, heat that Illinois politics sort of as an entity takes for kind of having that bad reputation.
Well, this is a particularly tough role or job to be having accusations of anything, untoward. What does the Auditor General do, and kind of what does that office symbolize in Illinois?
It's the Frank Martino's predecessor, Bill Holland, was roundly, people believed he was very successful, very honest, very forthright. He's a check on the rest of state government in a way, because make sure that money isn't being wasted throughout the various state government agencies. So it was almost, you hear people talk about the Bill Holland Auditor General office being the gold standard of how government should work. He was, some of his audits exposed some of the stuff from the Blagojevich administration that wound up with charges. So they were big shoes to fill already, but with some of these claims being made, it becomes sort of tougher to live up to that.
Well, and Jordan, you're watching some legislation that maybe isn't moving yet, but as I said, when we get to the end of the month, we kind of see bills start to fly quickly. You're looking at some things that would affect the Springfield area, keeping an eye on those. Can you tell us what some of those bills that you're watching
there
are?
are a couple bills. One to reopen the State Museum. That's going through the rules process right now, but that is very slow moving. So we have a couple local lawmakers who are sponsoring a bill to start charging admission and reopen that facility. They say that there's no reason it should have been closed. It's bad for the local economy. So we could see the State Museum reopen a little sooner than the rules process if that bill moves forward. And then we also have another one by a couple local lawmakers that would create a foundation for the state fairgrounds to improve the fairgrounds. We see a lot of dilapidated buildings and it's just in bad shape. And right now the state obviously doesn't have a lot of money to invest in the state fairgrounds. And so they'd say, well, if we can raise money from private donors, we can fix this place up. And a lot of other states do this. So we might see some movement on those two bills.
Well, and Andy, I just want to take, we got about a minute left, a second to explain to folks, we're putting a lot of emphasis on why the budget needs to be done by the end of this month, but we don't often cover why that is. It doesn't actually have to be done, but there's a reason why this is kind of a big deadline, right? Can you explain that for us?
Yeah, the adjournment date, May 31st. After that, the threshold for passing legislation through both chambers goes up. Essentially, you need a supermajority to get things through. And so that's why toward the end of session, not just budget, but any other topic, the daily fantasy stuff, the smoking age, all that type of stuff, you'll see sort of this rush to get those things through because they just need a simple majority in each chamber. Come May 31st, that's not the case. You're going to need a supermajority to get stuff passed, and that's a lot harder.
So you have to round up a lot more votes. If we don't see a budget by the end of this month, what can we expect? Are we going to see continuous session again? What might happen?
Great question. If you talk to Speaker Madigan, he will say that they've been in continuous session for over a year now, or close to a year now. So you might see more of that. It'll be difficult to sort of it's already difficult to get a budget through. It'll be more difficult, I think, as time goes on. And you have people openly wondering, we might not get a budget for 2 years,
Well, and we're going to have to leave it at that. I'd like to thank my guests, Jordan Abudayyeh and Andy Maloney. And I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues. And we'll see you next week on Capitol View.